So last time we talked about physical and cognitive development, and so today we'll talk about social and emotional development. But again, we're still in early childhood, so just a reminder, we're kind of talking ages like 2 to 7 up to like 2nd or 3rd grade is kind of the time period we're looking at here. So we're going to start with Erikson's psychosocial stage, just like we have in some of the other stages. We'll talk about the development of initiative, which is really kind of developing more skills. Development of self-esteem is also kind of starting in this period and is really crucial during early childhood. That's going to be influenced pretty heavily by peers, by parents, by teachers, etc. We'll spend quite a bit of time talking about parenting styles, or sometimes it's referred to as child rearing styles. It kind of means the same thing. And you will also see there's some overlap between that and attachment styles as well, but it's slightly different. So parenting styles kind of start to become established during this period, and they have lifelong impacts, kind of like attachment styles. Another thing that's happening socially during this time is the development of kind of understanding of gender. So children are kind of like sponges absorbing all this very implicit kind of social cues about their roles based on their gender. They also start to develop some sense of gender identity at this time, although that'll become more solidified in adolescence as they go through puberty, which we'll talk about, I think not next week, but the week after. So those are some kind of the big takeaways for today. So like I said, starting with Erikson's psychosocial stage, that we're in the 3rd one here. So remember, they've had trust versus mistrust and autonomy versus shame and doubt at this point. Hopefully they've navigated through that successfully. So then the 3rd stage is initiative versus guilt. And initiative basically refers to the development of new skills. So if you think about a child from 2 to 7, kind of the developments in their skills, and that's very broad, right? So they're developing physical skills. We talked about some of that last time. Some of those motor developments, they're getting better at running and jumping and playing. They're becoming more competitive. So during this time, they often will play games with their friends. Again, those could be like physical games, like sports, or it could be, board games, video games, etc. They're also learning to draw, to write, to color, to do math, to read. And they're often being evaluated on those skills, mostly through school, but even maybe through like their parents. So it's really kind of blossoming all these different skills that they can develop. There are also some development of conscience as well, which we'll come back to this in a minute when we talk about morality and kind of aggression, their sense of justice. But they're also developing kind of this sense of what is right and wrong. So in general, from a parenting perspective, caregivers should be giving their children lots of opportunities to develop these skills as much as is practically possible. So giving them access to, like craft materials, or trying to enroll them in sports and extracurricular activities so they can test out those skills. On kind of the opposite end of the spectrum is the development of guilt, kind of similar to shame, which was in the last stage as well. Typically, guilt is going to develop if the parent or the caregiver is overly strict, and especially if the caregiver is very critical of the child, if they're not very accepting of whatever skill the child wants to develop. So maybe you have a parent who was really into sports in high school and they kind of want their child to follow in their footsteps. Maybe the kid doesn't want to do sports, they're more interested in scholastic things or whatever. If the parents aren't approving of that, if they're critical, then that can lead to this kind of sense of guilt. Also, parents who are really heavy in punishment, which again, we'll kind of circle back to this when we talk about parenting styles, that can lead to this sense of guilt and shame, essentially. So kind of related to that, during this stage, there's a lot of development in their self-concept. So at the end of toddlerhood, they're kind of, they've become aware at least that they are a separate person from other people, but they don't necessarily have much of an identity of who they are or what that means until kind of this early childhood period that's starting to develop. And there's kind of 2 different parts of this self-concept. One is self-image, which is just kind of like the descriptors that you might use to describe yourself to other people. Usually these are going to be observable characteristics. So it might be physical appearance based, like a child might be able to say, I have brown hair and brown eyes and I'm shorter than my peers or whatever. It also has to do with their preferences. So around this time, they will start to build a self-image based on, their favorite color, maybe their favorite TV show, or their favorite music, or their favorite foods, and they will often express who they are through those preferences. In addition to self-image is self-esteem, which is basically their internal judgment of their value or their worth. So basically judging if they're, good enough or not. A lot of that self-judgment, like I said, can often relate to things in school. So they're being very directly judged and evaluated by teachers and by peers, and that has a very direct influence on their self-esteem. In general, children during this time period, their self-esteem is somewhat inflated. They often cannot tell the difference between their actual competence and their desired competence. So they might want to be really good at math and reading, and even if they're maybe not so great at those things, they might kind of think of themselves as being good at it because that's what they want instead of what they actually are. There's quite a bit of evidence that the development of self-esteem during this time will carry through, a lot of the rest of the lifetime and will impact adolescence and adulthood. So very important kind of development that's happening at this time, basically. They are also continuing to make improvements in social competence. Again, topics we've kind of already talked about a little bit, but these are solidifying and getting better and better as they get older. Their understanding of other people's emotions and their ability to empathize are kind of starting to blossom and develop here. They are very good, or they're starting to get better at judging what causes other people's emotions. So, there's studies where they'll play out little scenarios, maybe show someone a video clip of maybe a kid is swinging and falls off the swing and starts crying, something like that. And then they will ask a child of this various age range, what do you think caused the child to cry? In the lower end, around 2, they usually don't necessarily have an answer, but as they get older, up into that 7 age range, they're much better at vocalizing the cause of someone's emotions. They're also much better at understanding sort of the consequences of how we express our emotions. So they start to understand that you can't just throw a tantrum and get what you want, that instead you need to express your emotions in a more productive, kind of healthy way. And again, I guess all that kind of relates to self-regulation. So they're much better at regulating, like I said, the way that they express themselves. They also are starting to develop more of those self-conscious emotions. So again, that kind of goes back to that idea of initiative versus guilt. They're starting to develop guilt, shame, pride. And again, all that ties into a lot of their schoolwork, relationships with their peers, things that are going on at school often. Let me make sure I'm not skipping anything important here. All right, also during this age, they're going to start developing more peer relationships. So up to, maybe 3 or 4, most children really focus entirely on their relationship with the parents. That's the prime relationship that's super important to them. But as they start getting into the later parts of this early childhood, they're shifting away from that and starting to care a lot more about their peer relationships. However, their peer relationships at this point are still very shallow. So oftentimes children in this age, they sort of classify friends basically just by who they play with or who seems to like them on any particular day. So their friendships are often fleeting and short-lived. So they might, have one best friend one day and then switch to another best friend the next day. I remember a little bit from when my son was this age, he would often be telling me about his new best friend and wouldn't even know their name because he hasn't even talked to them long enough to know who they are, but they would be his best friend for that day. And then he'd kind of move on.
Friends every day when he goes to wrestling practice.
Yeah.
I made new friends.
Yeah.
What's their name? I have no idea.
Yeah, no clue. They know often nothing about them, but they happen to play with them at one time, so that's their best friend. You can also observe differences in kind of the way that they play with children, kind of again from the beginning of this age range to the end. So they start out with very, like, play where they're basically not even associating with other children. They just happen to be in the same vicinity as them. Parallel play is where they're often playing the same thing or doing the same activity, but they're not interacting. So you might have two children that are kind of sitting next to each other. Both of them are playing with blocks, or both of them are coloring or whatever, but they're not influencing each other in any way at all. But they still might say, like, if, you know, they come home at the end of daycare and you ask them, what'd you do? They might say, oh, I played blocks with my friend, even though they're not really interacting necessarily. So by the end of this early childhood, when they're getting into like 5, 6, 7, they shift more to cooperative play, where they are interacting, they're influencing each other. Maybe they're working on building a tower with blocks together, or they're, you know, like we talked about a little bit about make-believe play last time. They often are now including other peers in that make-believe and kind of acting out scenarios together. They spend most of their time in this age, you know, when it comes to play, doing either constructive play, so that's doing sort of like craft-based, like I said, like coloring blocks, you know, maybe making little crafty things, or make-believe play, again, kind of like we discussed last time, pretending to be some particular occupation, playing out some scene that they've seen in a TV show, etc. And then, yeah, I kind of already said that. So friendships are often very shallow and fleeting, based on very superficial characteristics. Just, do we like the same thing? Do we happen to be playing together? And they shift a lot. Parents have a pretty direct influence on peer relationships still at this time. So often it will be parents that are making the decision of, like, arranging play dates. So children may mostly play with other children that are, you know, like their parents or friends, or they happen to work together. Parents also kind of model friendships as well. So children will often observe how their parents interact with other people and maybe model or mimic those behaviors. And maybe not surprisingly, children who are more like securely attached tend to have better peer relationships during this age. They're better at forming friends and then also maintaining those friendships for a little bit longer as well. Okay, so another kind of development that's happening socially during this time, like I said, is the development of parenting styles or child-rearing styles. And there are, you know, reported to be 4 kind of basic types of approaches to parenting. And all of these can be broken down based on kind of these 4 variables that I have listed here. So acceptance is basically the parent's willingness to accept the way that their child is expressing themselves. So do they accept the things that the child likes? Do they accept their behaviors, etc.? Involvement is the degree to which the parent is involved in their lives. Do they, you know, participate if the child's in sports? Do they go watch their sports games? Do they ask them about their day whenever they come home from school? Control is the extent to which the parent tries to control their child. Do they try to make all the choices for them, or do they let the child, you know, kind of, you know, have more control over themselves? That's related quite a bit to autonomy as well. So autonomy has to do with letting the child make their own choices. And so we have authoritative, authoritarian, permissive, and uninvolved are the 4 categories of parent. And like I said, they just vary across all of those different variables there. So it's been shown repeatedly that, I mean, I kind of hate sometimes talking about parenting in this way, like there's a good way and a bad way and the best way and the wrong way. But there's pretty good evidence that parents who use an authoritative style, their children will go on to be more successful in all the ways that we measure success in our society. So if someone has authoritative parents, then they're more likely to develop good relationships, they're more likely to succeed in academics, they're more likely to get a good job, to have like good romantic relationships, etc. So authoritative parents, they tend to be highly accepting of their child no matter what. So no matter what way the child chooses to express themselves, if they want to dye their hair, if they want to get ears pierced, if they want to listen to whatever music or watch whatever TV shows, authoritative parents are usually going to be very accepting of those choices. But they tend to be highly involved in their child's lives, so they want to participate in any activities they're doing. They want to have rich conversations with them about their friends and what's going on. They tend to take an adaptive approach to control. So in general, it's best to kind of start with a high level of control as the child is young, and then slowly, gradually release some of that control to them as they get older. So the authoritative parent will kind of adapt whenever the child is basically expressing an interest in control. And usually that's kind of the best marker. If a child is asking for more control in something, then usually that means that they are probably mature enough to handle that if they're wanting it. And so then, kind of adapting to that as appropriate. So that's kind of the authoritative style. I might talk more about it after we get through all four. We can kind of do some comparison and contrast. Authoritarian is one of the worst approaches to parenting, again, according to all those metrics that I just talked about at least. So authoritarian parents tend to be much less accepting if their child differs from them in any significant way. So often authoritarian parents want their child to be either just like they were when they were a kid, or they might have kind of a vision of what they wanted to be, and they sort of project that onto their child and try to get their child to live out vicariously what the parent wanted to do. Yeah, did you have a question? Yeah, I would say there's some overlap probably between narcissism and authoritarian. I would have to look at the literature, but I bet there's like a pretty high correlation between those. But yeah, so they're not accepting if their child differs in any way from what the parent expects them to do. They also often will have low involvement in the child's life. So they, don't necessarily participate in the sports and the extracurricular. They don't really engage in conversations to get to know who their child actually is. They also often are obsessed with control. So they have a high level of control throughout the entire childhood. They may be very coercive, trying to get the child to basically behave in a really specific way. And so because of that, the child often has very low autonomy. So they don't have a sense that they have control over themselves because the parents have basically taken all that control away from them. And then we have permissive and uninvolved, which are somewhat similar. So permissive tend to be highly accepting of their children. They're okay with, all the things I just talked about, dyeing their hair and etc. Typically, they're going to have pretty low involvement. They might have high involvement, but sometimes it's kind of maybe in a inappropriate way. So maybe the permissive parent sometimes almost wants to be like friends with their child instead of a parent figure. So they might become involved, but it's almost like they're trying to get into their child's friend group instead of parenting. The permissive parent from the beginning will often have very low control over their children. So they kind of just let the child do whatever they want without any consequences or repercussions, without any boundaries or routines set. And so the child has a high sense of autonomy because they're basically given control from the very beginning to do what they want. And then uninvolved parents are basically just neglectful. So they essentially, acceptance I would say is low, but it's not like they're necessarily intervening in any way. It's just that they don't really know who their child is, so they can't really accept them because they don't know who they are anyways. So they have low involvement, low control, and the child sometimes develops like an indifferent sense of autonomy because oftentimes in that case, if a child is neglected, there can be all kinds of negative outcomes and consequences. So the child might be allowed to make their own choices, but the consequences of those choices are not buffered or supported by their parents, so they don't necessarily end up with a higher level of autonomy. So everybody kind of understand the difference between these four parenting styles.
So what if a permissive parent becomes an authoritative parent?
Yes, these are great questions. So the original idea of parenting styles was maybe overly simplified in a lot of ways. Because the kind of suggestion was that there's these four, a parent is usually going to choose one and stick with it for most of childhood, and then the child's going to turn out however they do based on that. But there's all kinds of variables, right? One is that yes, parents do sometimes adapt their parenting style. They may change either because, something happens that makes them realize this isn't working, I need to change. They may just get older and have more experience. Another complication is oftentimes parents will use different parenting styles for different children. So they may take, kind of a permissive or, oftentimes kind of the stereotype, at least that I've heard, is that parents for the first time might take kind of an authoritarian approach a little bit, where they really want to control because they're maybe a little insecure about their parenting. They want to make sure that their child ends up perfect or whatever. And then with the second and the third kid, they might take more of like an authoritative or a permissive because they realize I can't control what my child does all the time. So their parenting can change if they have multiples, for each child. And then in addition, if you're in a two-parent household, then each parent may have a very different parenting style. So you may have one parent that's authoritarian and another that's permissive, etc. So there's all kinds of complicating factors that makes this a lot messier than it looks like with just this table.
Sounds like a headache for the child.
Yes, and for the parents too, having been on both sides right now. But again, okay, so kind of the idea is that children who are raised with, let's say, kind of the best outcome is they have two parents that are both authoritative, then that's usually going to be the best outcome, again, in all those metrics that I talked about at least. Children who have an authoritarian parent typically are going to end up with like the insecure attachment style. Usually, well, it kind of depends on specific details. Probably going to be mostly like insecure anxious. Remember, that's the one where they are sort of like they have an attachment to their parent, but it's very like anxious. Like they get anxious whenever the parent's gone, but they're also anxious when the parent's around, and so it's kind of like conflicting and confusing. What else? I think I have some notes about like different outcomes from these. Oh, so children who are raised by authoritarian parents tend to be, like I said, more likely to develop anxiety and depression. They tend to also have low self-esteem, and they may have issues with like anger and even like violence or aggression later on. Children with permissive parents, again, in general, tend to have they tend to act very impulsively, so they don't necessarily develop great like emotional control. And they tend to be very disobedient in other situations. So if you put them in like a school or a work context where someone is telling them what to do, since they're used to having that permissive parent, they often will not obey other like authority figures. And because of that, they often will have poor achievement in academics. And children with uninvolved parents tend to have, again, kind of similar to permissive, they have depression, poor emotional regulation, lots of difficulties with school achievement. But they also tend to develop more like antisocial personality kind of tendencies. So there's all kinds of, like long-term outcomes that are predicted from this. Again, I would say all of those are generalities, kind of just like we talked about with attachment styles. If you identify, oh gosh, my parents were whatever, does that mean I'm X, Y, Z? Probably not. I would say my parents were very permissive. Extremely permissive. I was allowed to do basically whatever, almost like uninvolved, like kind of bordering permissive and uninvolved, at least towards me. I have two older brothers. They treated my brothers very differently from the way they treated me. But yeah, I was kind of allowed to do whatever I want, and I got a PhD, so it's fine. I think Hannah had her hand up first.
The authoritarian, like, how exactly does it affect the kid, like, later on?
So usually they're going to have anxiety issues, depression. They often will like mimic the same thing. So another thing about these parenting styles is people often tend to then do the same thing when they become a parent. So when they have children of their own, they may sort of replicate that authoritarian style. Is there anything like specific you're wanting to know about?
Like it makes them really anxious, or does it make them more like aggressive as a person?
Potentially. I would say authoritarian and uninvolved are the two that are most likely to develop like aggressive tendencies. Trying to think what else, if there's anything like specific. I would say like in relationships, so we could also talk about how this affects their romantic relationships later on. Often people who come from an authoritarian household will kind of almost treat their spouse similarly to that parenting style, so they may be really controlling in their relationships, probably even in like friendships and other kinds of relationships as well. I'm trying to think if there's anything else I know off the top of my head of like what outcomes that leads to. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
I'll share a little bit. I have an authoritarian parent, and I can't confirm I'm a little mentally ill.
I think it also sometimes leads to like a perfectionism a little bit that can be maybe, detrimental in certain cases. So Yes, but at least you know. And then like that's the other thing too. I think this is helpful from the perspective of looking back at your own childhood, maybe trying to identify if you feel like you have any issues right now. Maybe this is part of why. And now if you have that information, you can take it and go forward and hopefully grow and improve from that. Yes, yeah, but then you have to acknowledge if the way you grew up is your parents' fault, then the way that they grew up is their parents' fault, and then the way that your grandparents grew up is their parents' fault, and it's all just like a cycle that you got to break at some point.
I have something to say about that. I
Yeah.
think parents should choose to break the cycle and that they can.
Oh yeah,
If
yeah.
you let it continue, then that's on you.
Yeah, for sure. Like, yes. But then it's also, if they already let it continue and at this point, like, you're an adult, then now it's your turn to make that choice, right? That's kind of my perspective, at least. My parents did not break the cycle. I hope I'm breaking it, but we'll see. The other tricky thing with parenting is you often think that you're making a really good decision in the moment, but it's really, really hard to know how your decisions are going to, like, butterfly effect and actually affect your children in the future. So yeah, very difficult to do well sometimes. What else? I think that's all I have to say about parenting styles for now. Any other questions or comments about it? This will probably come up again because I'm sure whenever we talk about like adolescence and young adulthood, I might say something like, oh, if you had this parenting style, then you might turn out like whatever. So.
It's something that's kind of there in the background everywhere, so.
Yes, yeah, definitely.
I have one more question.
Yeah.
Do people with uninvolved parents like tend to be kind of like reckless when they're older, and kind of like thinking they can go out and kind of like do anything because they didn't really have any authority at all?
Yes, yeah. I would say both with permissive and uninvolved. There tends to be higher levels of like impulsivity and like making those decisions without really thinking it through and Uninvolved also tend to be very like just non-committal to things. So again, like with romantic relationships, they might not be monogamous or they might sort of pop in and out of relationships. They may be less likely to commit to like a career or a job for a long time. All right. So around this time, children are also developing a sense of morality, and a lot of that relates back to that parenting style. So a lot of a children's sense of morality comes from what they see in their parents and what their parents are teaching them, but other caregivers as well, from their teachers, from grandparents, etc. So during this time, they become better at kind of identifying justice and injustice. They will start to develop the ability to argue for what they think is justice. So if something happens that they think is unfair, then they will vocalize that, and they often will be able to express at least some sort of like logic to why they think something is fair or unfair. Although typically their sense of justice and fairness is going to be very simple and like black and white at this point in time. So they will not have any understanding of nuance or subtlety or context. It's basically like everyone should be treated equally, no matter what. Again, without any kind of nuance whatsoever. They tend to, so oftentimes you'll have like external rules that someone else has created. A parent figure or a teacher will express these rules verbally and also model behavior. Around this time, they're starting to internalize that. So they're taking the things that they've learned from other people, and it's becoming part of like their inner conscience, their inner monologue, the way that they talk to themselves, the way that they act, even if they're not being observed. So typically before this, especially in like toddlerhood, everything's very external. They have to be told every single rule, whereas now they're starting to internalize it and they can kind of act on their own based on what they've learned previously. I've kind of already said this, but a lot of their sense of morality and aggression comes from modeling and also conditioning. One thing I'll say about modeling is that typically children are going to mimic the behavior of their caregivers rather than what their caregivers say. So oftentimes a parent might give a rule and tell them to do something, but then the parent themselves might break that rule or do something different. In those cases, if there's like a inconsistency between what the parent's saying and what the parent is doing, or even if you have, again, like a two-parent household, if mom is saying and doing one thing and dad is saying and doing something different, or, you know, whatever the parents are, then they're often going to model the more lenient option. So if a parent says you shouldn't curse, but the parent curses all the time, then the child is probably going to curse, right? They're going to take the least strict behavior and copy that in general. Morality also comes through conditioning. So as we've talked about, basically whatever they're being rewarded or punished with, that is also going to help shape their sense of morality. In general, if a parent is using conditioning to try to teach their child a lesson or try to get them to understand something, reinforcement is going to work better than punishment. And there's a few reasons for this. One of them is just that reinforcement often tends to be very clear and it addresses a specific behavior, whereas punishment can often lead to kind of like vague outcomes. So let me try to think of an example. Let's say, what's a behavior you might want to punish in a child?
Slapping your siblings.
Okay, yes. So let's say one of your child slaps their brother or sister. And you obviously don't want them to do that, so you punish them. Maybe you put them in timeout or whatever. Then essentially what you've taught them is you shouldn't slap your sibling, but they could still punch their sibling or kick their sibling or bite their sibling, right? There's a million other ways that they could still do something that you don't want them to do. Whereas if they give their sibling a hug and you reinforce that, you give them some sort of reward for it, then they have learned it is good that I give my sibling a hug. That specific behavior is a good thing, right? So if you're punishing something bad, there's a lot of ambiguity there of ways that they could kind of like still do something wrong, but it's just not the same kind of wrong. Whereas if you're rewarding a behavior, you're rewarding something very specific and teaching them to repeat that behavior.
So this sounds very wrong, but essentially what should happen instead of punishing your child, you should treat your child like you're training your dog.
To some extent, I mean,
for doing what you want
yes,
them to do.
yes, I think that's, we got to recognize that at some level, the way that a dog operates is very similar to the way a human operates. I mean, everything we know about conditioning, which humans are very prone to, is based off of experience with dogs. So.
Based
My
on
grandma has been a dog trainer for my entire life, and everything that I've learned in this class, I'm like, yeah, my grandma taught me that.
Yeah, yes, yeah. It's all true for humans. I mean, if you look at a dog's brain and a human's brain are very similar, especially if we're talking about the areas of the brain that respond to like reward and punishment and that learn. Yeah.
well, you go back to the basics. We're all mammals. So,
Yeah. Yes. I mean, reinforcement is very effective, right? It's like, why are we all here today, right? It's like, I'm here, I enjoy teaching, but even the things I enjoy are reinforcement to some extent. Seeing all your smiling faces, seeing like the light bulb go off in your eyes when I say something that you learned something new, that's amazing. Getting paid is also awesome. Being able to afford food, right? All that's reinforcement. So,
Ultimately, that's the food.
yes, it does. So yeah, we learn a lot through conditioning, including morality and aggression. Let's see. I have aggression listed here. I haven't really talked about it much. I will say, so we kind of talked about with parenting styles, some of those, like authoritarian and the uninvolved, tend to lead to more aggressive behaviors than the others. Typically, a parent who's using a lot of punishment, especially physical punishment, will result in a child who is much more aggressive. So again, they're kind of modeling that behavior. So even if a parent, if you're telling your children you shouldn't hit other kids, but then the parent is hitting the kid to punish them, then they're going to learn that that's the way you resolve issues, is to hit other people. So physical punishment is very highly correlated with aggressive behaviors later on. That's especially true. So there is some research that shows that like spanking can be effective and not lead to aggression, but it has to be done in a very, very specific way that it almost never is done. It has to be done in a way where the child essentially, I'm trying to remember like all the steps that have to happen because it's a lot. Like the child has to be told ahead of time, basically there has to be a conversation about what you did wrong, why it's not okay, and then the spanking might happen. And then there's also sort of like a debriefing period to help the child deal with the emotions of that, etc. If spanking is done in very specific contexts like that, then it can sometimes be effective, especially for teaching really specific things. Usually it's only going to be effective if you're trying to teach a child that's kind of like a life and death matter. So if a child is constantly running out in the street and like they're going to get hit by a car, for example, and you've tried talking to them and like doing everything you can to stop them, and in that case it's like a life or death scenario, if you let this go on, they might get hit by a car, then in that case, spanking in all those conditions I just laid out might actually be effective. Most of the time, though, the way that physical punishment is done is not like that at all. It's usually often very impulsive. It's a parent reacting right away. The child does something wrong that the parent doesn't approve of, and they, hit them immediately. And then so the child has no context to understand where the punishment is coming from, and then there's no like emotional debriefing afterwards to help them, deal with that. That kind of physical punishment very likely to lead to aggressive behaviors later.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Like, what if you do the explanation, but it's kind of like the response to every mistake that your kid makes? Because I've known people where that was kind of the solution that was
Yes.
used every single time for them
Yeah.
when they were kids, and they were still like talked to and told why, but it was every single time they did something wrong.
I think I kind of understand what you're saying. So that reminded me to say something too about authoritative. Let me say that first, and then I think I might answer your question. So another thing that authoritative parents do, that's the good one, is that they often, the punishment style, quote unquote, I would say the discipline style is maybe a better word that they use, is that if a child makes the mistake, they take the time to explain why the thing that they did is wrong, what are the possible consequences for it, etc. And that usually is pretty effective in teaching children a sense of morality. But I think kind of what you're saying is like if it's overdone, to where like every single time they do something, maybe they're getting a whole lecture about what they did and why they did it.
Yes.
In that case, I could see, I don't know the research on that. I've never read like a study where they look at that. But just, I don't know, based on experience and anecdotally, I could see how that would, eventually the child might start to kind of like tune out what the parent is saying if they're getting bored of the lecture, if they feel like they're being especially like condescended, like if the parent's talking down to them in a way, like you're a kid, you don't understand, then they're probably just not going to listen at that point. I don't know if that would lead to aggression or anything like what we're talking about here, but they might not internalize it. Yeah.
Guys are learning a lot about me today. You learned to space out very well.
Yes.
Like, I catch myself just space out, and my friends will be like, hello, are you there?
Yeah.
I'll be gone for like 2 minutes, and then I'll come back, and she'll come back.
Yes, I've seen that. I've kind of almost like made that mistake, quote unquote, if you like with my own son, where I may be over explaining something for too long, and then I see that like at some point he just stops paying attention, and then I know like, okay, maybe give him some time to just like process it on his own, move on, So yeah, I can see what you're saying.
I know one thing for reinforcement, sometimes parents feel like they're being mean and tricking their kids. Because I had one person that I saw post on Facebook recently. They're like, "Oh, so my kid thinks that he's so slick. I told him I'd give him $1 for every book that he read.
Right.
I'm out $249, and he thinks he's cheating me.
Yeah.
He's read 249 books."
Well, that's probably good that he's read that much. It depends. Another thing we haven't talked about, I kind of talk about this in intro psych, but I don't know if you guys learned the same thing when you took it. With conditioning, if you have someone who's already internally motivated to do something, like they're reading because they enjoy it, they actually like reading, and then you reinforce that with money or whatever, it can actually decrease their like internal joy of that thing. So if they're already reading and they like it, you probably don't want to do anything. You want to just maybe encourage it, buy them more books, or like make book suggestions, but don't reinforce that behavior with money or treats or anything like that, or it'll actually decrease their joy of the thing. So, yeah. All right, these are all great questions. Thank you. Let me look at my notes.
Class that you've had so far.
I know, yes. Maybe we'll actually go to 145 today. We'll see. Probably not.
You just
It's hard.
space it.
Okay. I feel like I'm definitely forgetting to say some stuff about morality and aggression, but I don't. I just want to make sure I didn't skip anything like super important. No, I think that's all for now. The other thing with aggression, I will say, I'm not going to say much about it because our activity is going to be based on it, is like media exposure can also contribute to aggression quite a bit. But that's what our whole discussion is going to be about, so we'll talk about that in just a second. Okay, so just kind of recap so far. We talked about, they're making all these emotional developments. There's parenting styles coming in, teaching them morality, aggression, etc. In addition to all of that, children are also starting to become aware of and learn about gender and the ways that that can impact them and the people around them. So during this age from 2 to 7, children start to become very aware of gender roles. And this is true even if you, don't try to force gender roles on a child. They're very good at just implicitly picking up on what's going on around them in their classrooms, etc. So gender roles are basically kind of the expectations that we place on people based on whether they appear to be male or female. And these are learned through things like modeling, again. So if the parent is growing up if the child is growing up in a two-parent household and they have a mom and a dad, then they often are going to model themselves based on the same gendered parent, or at least the gender that they identify with. So if you have a child who identifies as male, they often are going to model their male caregiver's behaviors, more so at least than the other gendered parent. They also will model the behavior of teachers, aunts, uncles, any other adult caregiver as well. They're also learning gender roles through media, TV shows, movies, video games, all of that. And then peers start to have a bigger and bigger influence. It's starting to have some influence at this time. During adolescence, it will have a much stronger influence than it does now, but that's kind of starting to emerge in this early childhood. So preschoolers, often there's all kinds of studies that show that they associate certain toys, clothes, colors with particular genders. So you can give them, like a truck and a doll and ask them which, would a boy or a girl be more likely to play with these toys, and they will give the gender appropriate, based on society at least, response. So they'll say the boy should play with the truck, the girl should play with the doll. They associate, like pink with girls, blue with boys. And again, they will do that even if the parent is making a conscious effort not to have those gender roles in the household, because they're learning it from all these other places. Children during this time will start to develop stereotypes, which then could potentially be carried with them through, like I said, the rest of the lifespan, basically. During this time, though, they often will have stereotypes that are very rigid, so kind of like their sense of morality is very black and white and no nuance. Oftentimes, their understanding of gender roles is also very rigid during this time. So they may vocalize if they see a boy wearing pink or something. They might make a big deal out of it because they have this very rigid sense of what gender should be like. What's that?
My friend had to deal with that.
Yeah.
She went to Walmart one day and she had a little boy, but she buys whatever the heck she feels looks cute on him.
Right.
So he was wearing a pink Moana shirt or something like that. And then the little girl came over and said, "That's not a girl.
Right.
Why
Yes.
is he wearing pink?"
Yeah, yes. Children at this age have no filter, basically. So they will say whatever comes to their mind, whether an adult thinks it's appropriate or not. And again, their views are often very rigid and not very flexible. So, let's see. I'm trying to think if there was anything else. So there's some evidence I have here that it's driven by biology and experience. I will say a lot of these stereotypes are driven mostly by experience. There are some theories that try to explain, sort of from an evolutionary perspective, why we develop these gender roles. You guys might have heard these evolutionary theories just briefly. For example, there's some people who argue that, women developed particular gender roles based on the physiology of their body and just, biological things. So like there's a theory that says that women do most of the caregiving because their body was developed to do so. There's also maybe some evidence that some of this is driven by hormones as well. So hormones might play a role in sort of the roles that we take on for ourselves and the roles that we see for other people. But experience and environment has a much bigger impact on the specific kind of gender roles that a person develops and the stereotypes that they develop. The other thing kind of related to gender roles, around this time, children will often prefer to be with their same gender peers. So often their friend groups will be kind of segregated based on gender. People who identify as boys will hang out with boys. People who identify with girls will hang out with girls. Okay. I guess the other piece of evidence, too, that some of this is biological is that there are some things that are universal. Particularly, so I talked about more like superficial things like colors and toys and stuff, but there's also certain personality traits that kids tend to associate with certain genders. So they tend to associate that like boys are stronger, for example, and that tends to be true across cultures. So that would kind of suggest that, it's not a specific cultural experience that's causing that. If it's across multiple cultures, then that's usually used as a piece of evidence that something is more like biological. Last thing I will say too, typically boys breaking gender stereotypes tends to be more frowned upon by peers, parents, teachers, etc., than girls breaking stereotypes. So if a girl maybe dresses in kind of boyish clothes and like does sports and does the things that we typically attribute to a boy gender, then they are less likely to be like teased by their peers. They're more likely to be accepted by their parents and their teachers compared to if a boy like plays with dolls or wears pink or does the kind of typically girly associated things. So all of this, gender roles and a bunch of other things, feed into the child's gender identity. So gender identity is their own perception of how sort of feminine or masculine they are, how they want to express themselves as either male or female or non-binary. So gender identity begins to form around this time. Again, kind of like some of the other things I've talked about. It's sort of emerging around the end of early childhood, but it won't really solidify until probably adolescence when they start to go through puberty. Talk a little bit about gender dysphoria. We'll come back to it and talk about it more during adolescence, because again, that's kind of when it solidifies. But you do start to see some instances of gender dysphoria during this age group. Gender dysphoria is basically where the person has kind of a discrepancy between their sex that they were assigned at birth and their own gender identity. So someone who is born biologically male, if they identify as female, or vice versa, then that would be called gender dysphoria. And kind of like with gender roles, there are some biological and some social roots that contribute. I think I talked about this briefly, maybe when we were talking about like genetics. But there's some evidence that gender dysphoria there might be a genetic component to it, first of all. There also might be some contribution of the environment of the womb. So if you have a fetus who, let's say, has XX chromosomes, so XX chromosomes typically is going to result in a female. But let's say for whatever reason, the mother has like a flood of testosterone during that time. Testosterone is typically like the male sex hormone. So you have a fetus that's kind of genetically programmed to be female, but now you have this male hormone that comes flooding in. That can impact the way that that fetus develops. It might impact the development of the genitalia, depending on when, sort of the timing. It also can affect the development of the brain, especially if it's happening later in pregnancy. So there are some studies that have shown if you compare you take someone who's gender dysphoric and look at like their brain structure and their brain activity, it will often be more similar to the gender they identify with rather than their biological gender. So if someone, again, is born male physically, but they identify as female, their brain structure and activity will be more like a female, like a cisgender female, than it will be like a cisgender male. So there's biological things that are contributing to their gender identity is basically the point here.
So that would be the same vice versa if a fetus was gendered male,
Mhm.
but the mom, like her regular drinking water is contaminated with a lot of estrogen.
Yep.
So that it would have that same impact.
Exactly, yes, yeah. From the studies I've read. I don't know how much estrogen contamination there is or like what levels you need for it to influence. So I don't know if like that specifically would, but it potentially could, yeah. There's all kinds of evidence that shows that children who are gender dysphoric, they will have the best outcomes if their gender identity is accepted by parents, teachers, peers. That kind of relates back to like authoritative versus authoritarian. An authoritative parent is going to be very accepting, like we talked about. So they're probably going to accept if their child is gender dysphoric and they want to express their gender identity, whereas an authoritarian parent is maybe not going to be as accepting of that. And so the best outcomes come from expressing that identity and letting them dress the way they want, play with the toys they want, have whatever favorite color they want, etc. Any question about gender roles or gender identity? Okay.